Marangiaria, Nadu Yinjamara, Kulin Mine, Nadu Yinjamara, Wurundjeri Gare. In my language, Wiradjuri, I want to pay my respects to the people of the Kulin Nation and the land of the Wurundjeri people and where we meet tonight. Well, do you get your political views from sports people or musicians? Do we care what they think? Should they even have opinions? Well, let's meet our panel. Singer-songwriter and activist Billy Bragg, who will be performing a song from his latest album a little later. Professor with the School of Economics at the University of New South Wales, Gigi Foster. Labor member for Macnamara and chair of the Human Rights Committee, Josh Burns. Deputy Leader of the Nationals and Senator for New South Wales, Perin, Davey. And journalist, author and co-founder of Media Diversity Australia, Antoinette, Lattouf.
Should sports stars or TV personalities be allowed to express their opinions on politics or events that are in the news?
We're talking about Gary Lineker, of course, possibly. And what we saw in the UK, Billy, where match of the day, which is sacrosanct in the UK, was interrupted. Yes,
yeah, the footy. It's been incredible, really. I mean, what has been amazing is the solidarity of the other sports presenters, his co-presenters on the programme, the people who do the interviews, even the commentators on the games. And there was some talk that the players wouldn't have even spoken to them if they'd have been there. And that's, you know, on Labor Day, that's a great thing to reflect on, that people do still stand in solidarity with one another when someone's treated unfairly. And Lineker has been treated. And Lineker has been treated unfairly when you think of some of the things that Jeremy Clarkson has said, you know, really out of order. And the Daily Mail never gets on its hind legs and calls for him to be fired. So I think, well, you know, Lineker a politician, perhaps, then that would be, you know, that would be a different matter. But he's not working in the newsroom. He's working in sport. He has very strong views. I happen to know that he has housed refugees, and not Ukrainian refugees either, refugees from Africa and from India. So he feels very, very strongly about this. And I think people should have the right to express their views, their independent views. And I'm hoping the BBC sees sense. But to suggest the issue is impartiality, when the chair of the BBC is a very, very close friend of Boris Johnson, in fact, organised a loan for him, I think that's taking the mickey a bit, really.
Let's go to what Gary Lineker had to say. We'll just put this up on the screen for you. In response to the UK government's Stop the Boats policy, Gary Lineker tweeted, "There is no huge influx. We take far fewer refugees than other major European countries. This is just an immeasurably cruel policy directed at the most vulnerable people in language that is not dissimilar to that used by Germany in the 30s. And I'm out of order?" is the question that he asked. Now, there has been a statement from the BBC Director General as well, Tim Davey. They're going to have a review into this, an independent review reporting to the BBC, and they'll shortly announce who will conduct that review and looking at social media guidelines. I want to go to you, Antoinette, on this and go back to the question. Should sports stars, performers, whoever express
I'm going to jump in and say absolutely. I think they should. I think they have a responsibility to. When something is so egregiously and outstandingly inhumane, when there is proof in Australia of the impact offshore detention and processing has, how it's bad for the economy, it's bad for humans, it breaches international law. I think you have a duty and an obligation, if you have a platform, to say something. Now, we understand the BBC has recently updated its social media policy so that it extends not just to journalism or journalists or newsrooms, but anybody who's on air. And I know it's tricky.
Can I just ask, sorry, Antoinette, how you manage this as a journalist?
And I was going to say, this is really tricky for me as well, because there is this sense that you need to be impartial. There's this sense that you need to all sides. You know, you've got to get that perspective and that perspective. But there are some issues that don't need that equivalence. And I think it's a false equivalence to be like, so what do you think about locking up, you know, humans in cages like animals and it costing $3.5 million a year to keep them off our shores? What do you think about that? Let's get your perspective on whether neo-Nazism is good for us. It's like, no, these don't require questions. These are objectively wrong. The answer is clear. And sometimes, Stan, I'd imagine this is the same for you as a First Nations man, when you have skin in the game as well and are a journalist, it can be particularly tricky, and you can't just have in your Twitter bio, views are my own, not my employer's. And because when there is that lived experience, it's hard to separate yourself. So I'd imagine...
And you're not at work all the time.
And you're not at work all the time. Like I imagine even with The Voice, I wanted and I hesitated to put my position. You know, I want to be on the right side of history, and I think Australia needs to get this right. But I hesitated and thought, oh, should I put that out there, what I think? Equally, people like me who hail from the Middle East struggle really to weigh into the ongoing human rights atrocities and the apartheid-like state and the treatment of Palestinians. Again, that's an issue that needs balance. But when there's a power imbalance, sometimes the issue doesn't need power imbalance. Where there's a clear victim, sometimes it doesn't need a balance. And I think there needs to be a bit of room for people who have skin in the game, and when the data and the evidence proves so clearly who the victims are and who the perpetrators are, you should be able to...
Might you get a quick response from our politicians here about this as well, Josh? Watching on and seeing that are there lines that can be crossed that people shouldn't cross?
Well, I have real issues with government trying to strangle the fourth estate as a principle. I think that our job is to run the government, and the media's job is to be honest about what's actually happening and the decisions are being made. And it's a pretty dangerous game if the government tries to intercept that. I also would say that, you know, I'm a bit reluctant to get into the domestic politics of the UK. We have plenty of that in Australia, plenty of strange and wonderful things happening in our politics.
Well, Josh, I just should remind you then who's advising the British government on this policy.
Yeah.
A certain Tony Abbott.
Yeah.
Is advising.
And also...
So maybe you do have skin in this game.
Yeah, and also that it remains the Labor's position, it remains Australia's policy.
Yes. So Tony Abbott and I've actually never really had a conversation with Tony, but I certainly think that he and I are on different sides of this particular issue. On the issue of...
You're still keeping offshore detention in
so
Macnamara.
let me get to that. On the issue of offshore detention, we have, since coming into government, we're now down to, as far as the latest numbers that I've been given, is 54 people on Nauru, and we need to keep working until each and every person is off Nauru. That's the first thing to say.
But you'll keep it open. But you will keep it open.
Yeah, I know, and it is a pretty messy policy area, but I do think that you have to come at this from the premise that we can't be using vulnerable people as a political football. And if we get to the end of the term where we don't send anyone back there and that we empty off the offshore detention and we actually increase our humanitarian program, we've already changed the policy to get rid of Abbott and Howard's temporary protection visa and safe haven visas, short-term visas for bona fide refugees, 19,000 people in Australia. There is significant reform that has been done. The world hasn't fallen in. The boats haven't started. We've got more work to be done, but we can do this in a more humane way.
Perin's waiting to come in here. It was your government's policy that now the UK is adopting that led to this, that led to Gary Lineker making the comments.
Well, it was actually the previous Labor government's policy, which we kept up, but we also started the work to empty the overseas detention centres. We reached agreements with America to rehome refugees over in America. So, yes, there's 54 now, but when we inherited government, there were thousands of people in overseas detention. We whittled that down to hundreds. So we started the hard work. But the real issue here is the question was about should sports stars have opinions? Well, I think that's fine, have an opinion, but opinions, free speech, comes with responsibilities. And when you look at the sports stars around the world who've been cancelled, you know, if it's okay to cancel Israel Folau and Margaret Court on the one hand, then you've also got to be open to people calling for cancellation on the other hand, because we live in a society where there are shades.
Do you think he should be cancelled?
The other thing to remember is Gary Lineker was on the public purse. Israel Folau and Margaret Court were not on the public purse when they made comments. So he wasn't cancelled.
So it was okay for him to be stood down, is that what you're saying?
Well, the equivalent of Australian $2.4 million from the BBC paid to Gary Lineker, and the BBC has an impartiality clause in their social media policy. ABC also now has a stronger social media policy. So if you are on the public purse and you've signed a contract that says you will abide by the social media rules, then you need to think about those before you make a statement. And if you want to make the statement, then, you know, think about the contracts you've signed. I'm a big believer in free speech of all platforms. I absolutely agree that, you know, journalists particularly should be able to present articles well-researched, well-considered, and there's journalism and there's the commentariat, and absolutely we should have that. But we also should understand that there are obligations. If you sign a contract with, you know, social media clauses and you're taking British taxpayers' money, and a lot of it, I was amazed by how much he's paid.
He's their most expensive TV star. He's top of the range, Gary Lineker, right?
Yeah.
So,
I mean, that's what I would say.
Okay.
Thanks. I'd firstly just like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land that we're meeting on today, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. 3 years ago, as a Year 12 student, I asked the panel how they could justify doubling the price of my university fees as a prospective arts student, and now 3 years later, I've been forced to drop out of university because I simply can't afford to keep studying while keeping up with the rising cost of living. I've been forced into a position of putting my education on hold because I need to work full-time to support myself. My bills continue to rise. Owning a home just seems like a pipe dream, and it doesn't look like it's going to get any better. What would you say to me and other young people in my position, and why must I decide between getting an education and putting food on the table?
Gigi.
So thank you very much for your articulate exposition of your situation. I'm very sorry to hear it. And unfortunately, this is some of the consequences that we're seeing of the mismanagement of our economy over the last few years. We have spent hugely, as I said previously, for very, very little return, and on things that were never really predicted to even have much of a return. It was a religious expenditure. And in fact, there are many other things that have happened to us that we don't even really hear much about in the media these days that are other consequences of those mismanagements. For example, there are tens of thousands more Australians we've lost since the middle of 2021 than we should have by historical standards. And not all of those are COVID deaths by any stretch of the imagination. So what are they? Delayed lockdown deaths, deaths of despair, people who had crowded out cancer screenings now dying of cancer, vaccine side effects. What is it? This should be front page news in every Australian paper, but you don't hear about it. And we know that the decisions made during that period were for politics, not for health. And
How does that play into Bella's situation?
These decisions are the ones that she is feeling the consequences of right now. The politics that in the UK, which is what's coming through in the Matt Hancock WhatsApp files, the lockdown files that's being published in the Daily Telegraph, whole bunch of messages from this guy who was doing policy in COVID showing that it wasn't about public health promotion. Those policies created the economic crisis that we are now living through, that you are now living through, and you are paying the price, unfortunately.
To be fair, Gigi, yes, I understand the expenditure with COVID, but the cost of living and housing affordability, that particularly in Sydney and Melbourne, that has been as a result of government policy for years, like negative gearing, housing supply. This isn't because of COVID.
Housing supply is a big problem, and I totally agree, and I think the government should be building housing, and it doesn't want to because it's too hard, right? But government should be doing that. We should fix the housing supply problem. We should be holding the developers to account to actually develop quickly when they get the rights. But the COVID problem was dealt with so poorly now that we have created an inflationary environment where house prices are going up, but so are food prices.
House prices are coming down though as interest rates are going up. Isn't that the case?
Well, mortgage payments are going up, right? So housing costs, which is what you're feeling, right? I mean, rental market is also going up.
I might go to you, Billy, on this as well. What are you seeing in the UK? Because you've been through a bruising time as well with runaway inflation. There are people in the UK who are wondering whether do I heat my house or do I eat? This is, and we've got a growing wealth gap around the world as well. What are you seeing there, and are you seeing signs of it here when you visit?
Well, I don't think it's anything to do with the pandemic. I mean, in our country, the government had to act in the common good, and sometimes you have to do things in the common good that cost money for the benefit of the majority of people. So I don't think you can blame it onto that, Gigi. But there has been a big problem over the last couple of years. Again, as you mentioned, with the lack of housing, we don't have enough houses, and wages are not keeping up with inflation. And obviously, the price of heating oil, the price of petrol, because of the war in Ukraine, has had an effect on our economy, plus the fact in 2016 we voted to impose tariffs on ourselves, and that didn't work out very well either. So with all those things taken together, our young people who have for 2 decades at least now have struggled to get into the job market and to get a decent living and get into the housing ladder are suffering even more. And I think we have very good grounds for making education something that's free at point of need. It's certainly something I'd like to see in my country. I don't know how it would play over here, but it was certainly to send our young people into the world without a huge debt hanging over their heads. I think that would be a positive thing.
Bella, you actually ran for Parliament, didn't you, at the last election for the Greens? Is that something you're still considering in the future? What's your future look like right now?
Well, the last time that I asked a question,
That was a few years ago, wasn't it?
A few years ago. It was 3 years ago. I asked how the then Liberal government could justify increasing, like doubling my uni fees. And I believe it was the Labor member on the panel said, go out, you've got to get out and you've got to get into politics, and that's exactly what I did. But I am very passionate about politics, but I don't feel like it's for me. I still want to pursue an arts degree though. So that's the thing as well. I can't afford to go to uni, but once I finally somehow do get the money to do it, I'm now in $50,000 worth of debt. And so I don't know how to escape this. You know, it's just constantly
$50,000 worth of debt and being an artist. That's a. You see, this is the point about an education. You shouldn't just be making young people ready to work in offices and factories. They should be able to find their full potential, their creative potential. You know, I was very fortunate. I lived in a time where you could go on the dole and nobody really, came around and knocked on the door and chased you. So the British taxpayer,
get a guitar and make a living. Yeah,
the British taxpayer paid for my apprenticeship as a rock and roller. I've paid my way back to them, and many more people could do that if only we would encourage our young people to go out and realise their full potential.
Well, the thing is as well, I need an arts degree. I want to be a secondary teacher. I want to be a high school teacher. Yeah. And there's such a call for teachers. Exactly, that's what I'm saying. There's such a call for teachers, and yet it seems impossible for me to achieve that. Yeah. And I completely understand saying where these problems are coming from, but I'm not hearing a lot of answers. What's actually going to be done about it, because I actually don't know where to go.
Okay, well, here's one thing, Bella. Both politicians here come from parties committed to actually giving tax cuts to the richest people in the country. Josh, are you going to repeal stage 3 tax cuts so that people like Bella can go to school?
Yeah. You really want to make me really popular with my colleagues, Dan. Let me try and answer Bella's question.
Well, you're not going to answer it.
No, I'm going to try and answer Bella's question. No, I'm actually going to try and answer Bella's question instead of yours, if I can. Bella, I was an arts student as well, and I really hope you can get back there and finish your degree. And it's really important. We do need good quality teachers. We also need quality people in politics. But putting that aside, there's 2 parts to this, I think. One is about how do we make university more affordable, which is a really important question. There is a review going on at the moment into our university system, and one of the key questions that we're going to be looking at is the affordability of university. I think it was a retrograde step to make humanities degrees more expensive, and I certainly don't support that, don't advocate that, and we'll be looking to see if we can make humanities a priority again after the accord is delivered. The other question is around how do you actually deal with the cost of living pressures? And Bella, this is a really important question with, I wish I had a really simple answer. Inflation is something that is being felt right across the world. There are some steps that have been taken, things like lifting the minimum wage, like supporting the wages of people in aged care, working in aged care and childcare, industries dominated by feminised workforce. Also around trying to make things more affordable for families, which I know in your situation, making childcare more affordable might not be the most important thing for you, but for some families that has made a difference, medicines and other things. So there has been some steps taken. It is a long way back.
Right.
Inflation is a wicked problem, but I really hope you get to finish your degree, Bella.
So do I. Really quickly, Perin, because we need to move on.
I just want to say, if you want to be a secondary teacher, one policy that we fought for in the last parliament, and then we went into caretaker mode, but thankfully, credit where it's due, Labor did bring it back, was to waive HECS debts for important industries if people are willing to move to the regions. Housing is more affordable in the regions too, so I would just big shout out to moving to the regions. If you get your degree and you commit to a 4-year stint in the regions, your HECS debt is waived. So consider that as an option for your future, and you'll move out there, you'll love it, you'll never come back to the city, and you'll help increase our...
I'm a church musician. Sometimes I change the words of hymns to decolonise them or to make them more relevant. And I was at a new musical called And Juliet, where the context of the song was changed by, say, the gender of the person singing. Billy, you changed words to the lyrics. You're brave in that regard. Why do you do it, and should we do more of it?
Well, I think you do need to, if you're going to write songs that are, reflecting the way the world is and times change, you do need to update words sometimes. I mean, some words can stand alone. I mean, Woody Guthrie wrote This Land Is Your Land 80 years ago now, and that still resonates with a lot of people. But, for instance, I wrote a song called Sexuality in the 1990s, a song of allyship with the gay and lesbian community. And a couple of years ago, I was in Boston and doing a bit of signing after the show, and a woman said to me, "You know that song, Bill, where you go for a beer with that gay guy? It's not very radical anymore, is it, mate?" And she was right. We've come a long way, we've come an incredible way with that. And she pointed out rightly to me that the real front line now is with the trans community. So I've slightly tweaked the lyrics of the song to make it a song of allyship to the trans and non-binary community. And I think you need to do that. I think it's be like, if you're an activist, you're out in the 1980s with the miners. Is that it? Or do you still engage in the way that you did then? Because, we can never remain pretty, and we can never remain hip either, trust me. I've tried that as well. But there's no reason why we shouldn't remain relevant. So in order to make the songs relevant, whether you're changing the lyric or changing the gender or just doing Shakespeare in modern clothes, just to make it relevant to connect with the audience that you're talking to, I think that's the way art works.
Thanks for the question, mate. And I would say to Billy that I think it's a pretty important thing that you actually did change those lyrics in solidarity with the trans community. In Australia, Stan, 1 in 2 trans kids make some attempt on their life as a child. And these kids have a challenging enough world as it already is without some of the culture wars that we see day to day, not just in Australia but around the world to some of these kids. And, where my grandmother left, they made the Jewish community wear a yellow star and they made the LGBTIQ community wear a pink triangle. And if you come for one, you come for all. And I think the solidarity that you showed, Billy, is really important, and that we should be giving people a bit of respect, a bit of dignity and a bit of acceptance, because everyone deserves to be a part of a community and everyone deserves to have Billy Bragg songs written about them as well.
And thank you. I want to bring Gigi in just a minute. But Josh, can I also talk about language? And even tonight, and I know Antoinette didn't mean it in an offensive way, but references to neo-Nazis, Gary Lineker talking about the 1930s, and as a Jewish person, language has power, and when you hear things like that, how does it make you feel?
My honest answer is I'm not sure it progresses the argument that much, and in fact it has to be a pretty important historical comparison in order to use it, would be my sort of disposition. If it's done in a respectful way, it's obviously better than others, and I don't think for one second Antoinette meant it in a disrespectful way. But
it's just language,
yeah.
and how language is used and how language becomes popularised, and being aware of language is probably the critical point, isn't it? And Gigi, You're actually not in favour, though, are you, of changing things retrospectively?
Well, I think that Billy should be free to change the lyrics of his songs. Absolutely, they're his songs. And if it makes him feel better or it makes him think he's going to sell more songs or be more relatable, then that's fine. But what I really object to is changing our own artists who have already given their stories,
like Roald
changing
Dahl.
Those stories, like Roald Dahl, for example, for a number of reasons. First of all, because you are taking away his voice. That is censorship. Secondly, you are essentially stripping future art historians of the opportunity to study the progression of art through the ages. You're changing what we have had. And when in the history of man has artistic censorship led to something we can all get behind, like more liberty, more freedom, more equality? Generally speaking, artistic censorship is associated with politics. And art is not a place to do politics at its best. Art reflects the society that it is created in.
But things are, you mentioned before changing church songs or hymns.
Yeah,
I mean, the Bible's been rewritten many times. Things are changed, aren't they,
Do
Antoinette?
you think, like, changing the word fat and crazy is artistic censorship?
Yes, I do. If those were Roald Dahl's words, yes.
But unfortunately...
And can I just say, if you don't like those words, if you don't like Roald Dahl's story, write your own story.
Yeah, I just don't like the idea of I'm sorry, but if it's not acceptable to call someone fat in society, and I don't think it is personally, why should we be telling our children it's okay?
Well, you don't have to buy the book.
And Dahl particularly used fat as a characterisation of someone to say that they were lazy and a characterisation. That's not the way to do it.
Do you really think that, do you have the conceit to believe that your morality today is the ultimate and perfect morality for all time?
No.
I mean, when people write things, when they write them thousands of years ago, hundreds of years ago, or in the future, they have a particular view of their society and they are reflecting their society in their art. You can tell a different story now. That's fine. That's great. That's progress. But to silence those who have come before us?
Freedom of speech gives you the right to express... Freedom of speech gives you the right to express your opinion. It doesn't give you the right to be abusive, I'm afraid. And I think there has to be a limit. There has to be a limit on what we can say. Sure, we can offend. Of course we can offend. But I think that sort of abusive language has no place in children's books whatsoever.
But I think what we're doing by... and I agree with Gigi on this. I think it's great for you to change your own works, and I think that's good. And with permission, because I know Bobby McGee has been variously a male and a female character in a fantastic
fine song it is too.
But changing form art or someone else's words to bring it up to today's moral standards actually takes away our opportunity to have a conversation and to say, well, that was...
But isn't that part of the conversation? Shakespeare is reinterpreted, rewritten. Yeah. I mean, isn't that part of the conversation?
But by then, children, I have young children who read Roald Dahl. By then, in the schoolyard, they're calling people fat and crazy. Those biases are already entrenched. And so it's awkward when you're trying to teach your children, hey, don't call that person fat and crazy, and then every second child has read a Roald Dahl book, and really it's a commercial reality. The estate stipulates that they can be changed to sell books. They want to sell books, they need to be relevant, and so the decision was made to take out some of that language. It doesn't change the storyline. It just means that we're not demonising a certain person based on appearance. We're not equating fat with lazy and useless.
Well, to be honest, honestly, a lot of the language that we have been using today, is dividing people. You are dividing people by skin colour. People are being divided by whether they're fat or thin. People are divided by this, that. No, let me finish. This kind of language is not helpful. Let me finish, please.
I just want to...
May I please finish?
Go ahead.
This kind of language is not helpful because it draws us away from each other. When all of the problems we have today, from children in the playground who aren't being tolerant to each other, to politicians making decisions that are not in line with what is good for people at the lower end of the income scale, these problems are things we need everybody to come to the table and solve together as human beings, not as people who are white or black or men or women or old or young. We need everybody, and we need a diversity of opinion. And by the way, if you agree with me, please visit scienceandfreedom.org, Australians for Science and Freedom.
We need to be able to talk about inequality, that inequality that impacts people based on gender, on sexuality, on ability, on race. Like, it's really lovely and kumbaya to be like, oh, we can't talk about this because we're dividing. People are divided. Their life chances and opportunities
But then
are
by
limited.
re-editing books and taking away things and saying, oh, no, we don't want that in there because that might offend someone, instead of actually saying, you know, sitting down, my kids read Roald Dahl, and unfortunately I couldn't get them across to the Enid Blyton Famous Five because they were my favourites. But, you know, and sitting there going, no, we don't call people fat, we don't call people idiots, because that's not the appropriate way to talk to people. And even when Roald Dahl wrote them, you're right, he wrote them to be offensive about the characters. And it opens the conversation.
We'll just put a pause there on it because it's a conversation we've had before and I'm sure we'll have it again. But could I just get a quick show of hands? There's been a lot of cheering for all sides here. Hands up if you think it's okay to change books that have been written in the past for today's audience. Hands up. And hands up if you think it's not okay. Okay, there you go. There's a straw poll for us.
I mean, the point that about what you were saying there, Gigi, is that the arc of history is long, but it bends towards inclusivity. You know, that's the way history moves, okay? And unfortunately, there are still people who are being excluded.
I completely agree.
Okay, so we can't just sit down and say everybody can come to the table when they can't physically come to the table.
So
you need a process of inclusion in order to bring people in.
Okay.
And can I just say that inclusion begins with acknowledgement. That's the very beginning. When you acknowledge there's a problem, without acknowledgement, you have no change whatsoever.
Please thank our panel tonight. Billy Bragg, who is about to perform for us, Gigi Foster, Josh Burns, Perin Davey and Antoinette Lattouf. Please thank them.